Thank you for having us. We're really happy to have the chance to share what we're doing out in the field. And so this first thing to share with you is a short video. It's just about 7 minutes. And it's what I've been working on all winter long. And you will see our environmental analyst, Jamie Carr, is featured on this video. And he's going to tell you how road salt is really persistent in the environment and things you can do to help. And I just wanted to make a note and thank Sterling for having a covered salt shed and brine spreading capabilities. So thank you for that. And here we go.
Hello, my name is Jamie Carr, and I'm an environmental analyst with MassTCR's Division of Water Supply Protection. Today we're going to talk about road salt, or sodium chloride. So the way that road salt can help us manage snow and ice in the wintertime is a really big help for public safety. However, in the Wachusett watershed alone, up to 18,000 tons of road salt are applied each year. So where does all that salt end up? It actually ends up right here in the reservoir. So once salt is put down on a road, it ends up ultimately in the waterways. We can see it and we can measure it in tributaries to the reservoir, in lakes and ponds, in the reservoir itself, and now even in the groundwater. So salt raises the salinity of water, but it's not good for fresh water and the organisms that are here in the reservoir. Zooplankton are tiny aquatic animals that live in the water. They eat algae, and they have an important role to play in keeping the water clear. It just so happens that zooplankton are one of the more sensitive species and organisms to increases in salinity. They can change the population dynamics of the zooplankton, and that has impacts on the algae and the water clarity. They're also an important part of the food chain. So if you have zooplankton and algae populations change, those are what feed the small fish, the larger fish like lake trout and brook trout, other animals at the higher up in the food chain like bald eagles and loons, and even people. And if you start causing problems in the food chain, then that's a problem for water quality. So how do we know? So how do we measure the changes in the salinity of water? Well, there's a measurement called specific conductivity. So as salt dissolves in water and takes the space in between the water molecules, it becomes better at conducting electricity. So we can use a handheld probe in the water to measure the specific conductance of the water. And it turns out that's a lot easier than collecting a sample and sending it to the lab and measuring the precise amount of chloride in the water. And the two things correlate very well. So we can get the results immediately with the handheld probe. So DWSP measures specific conductance in the reservoir, in tributaries, and in 8 groundwater wells in the watershed. For example, here is a graph of the specific conductance collected at Gates Brook, a direct tributary to Wachusett Reservoir. This is a continuous data set from 1989 to the present day in 2022. You can see that values used to fall under 500 microsiemens per centimeter. Nowadays, we commonly record values over 1,000, and even higher. You can see from the trend line that values have been increasing a lot over time. So we are now seeing evidence that chlorides are creating a long-term problem with the levels that we're seeing in groundwater in particular. So this is important to consider because groundwater is the source of drinking water for a lot of private and municipal wells in the watershed. And ultimately, those chlorides end up in the reservoir, which is the drinking water supply for over 3 million people. Watershed management supplies source water that requires the least amount of treatment. The Massachusetts Water Resources Authority treats water to provide some of the best drinking water in the country. This problem is not unique to the Wachusett watershed. Higher levels of chloride have been documented in fresh water across Massachusetts, the Northeast, and even nationwide, everywhere road salt is used in winter. And that's not the end of the negative impacts either. Road salt can cause the underside of vehicles and equipment to rust more quickly. It can degrade concrete structures. It can cause plants along the roadside to get burned by salt. Water that's high in chloride also promotes corrosion of pipes in the water supply system. So it can make contaminants that are already present in the system come out more easily and enter the drinking water. And it can make it difficult to make a good cup of coffee. So you can think that the salt that's affecting your coffee in the water you used this morning might have been put down on the road 10 years ago. It's very persistent in the environment. So what can we do to keep the amount of salt down? The Division of Water Supply Protection is committed to finding ways to reduce salt use in the Wachusett Reservoir watershed by working with local town Department of Public Works, Mass DOT, and you to come up with creative solutions to the problem of salt contamination. You may have noticed that before a winter storm, you might see trucks on the roadways applying a liquid, making the roads look wet or leaving lines on the road surface. That liquid that's being put down is known as brine, which is a mix of about 23% sodium chloride and 77% water that pre-treats the road, which actually prevents snow and ice from getting stuck to the road surface itself. This method not only keeps roads safe from the start of a weather event, but it also makes snow removal easier. And in the end, it drastically reduces the amount of salt that would be used later in the storm. Check with your town to see if they've already started or are considering using brine to pre-treat roads. Switching to brine has upfront costs in terms of new equipment, but over time can reduce costs and salt use by as much as 30 to 40%. If you do use salt at home, please do so minimally and responsibly. A 12-ounce coffee mug filled with rock salt will treat a 20-foot long driveway. Any more than that won't actually melt snow and ice any faster. Lightly pre-treating an area with rock salt before a storm is the way to go. Just make sure there's space you can see between the grains when you put it down. If there's some left over after the storm, that means you used a little bit too much this time. And if you do have some left over, you can sweep it up and use it for the next storm. That way you're saving salt and saving money. If you're up for it, you can try making your own brine solution at home in a pump sprayer. Videos are all over the internet, and they'll explain how to add straight salt to water to make your own brine. And, if at all possible, stay home during a storm. Don't expect to drive during and immediately after the storm. Give the snow removal crews plenty of time and space to make the roads safer. So while it's necessary to maintain roads in the wintertime to keep them safe for people, if we don't start doing it while using less salt, then we're going to continue to see severe impacts to aquatic life. So using salt in a smarter way, we can save money, we can still maintain public safety, we can protect the environment, and we can preserve our drinking water quality. So salt smarter and not harder. Sometimes ice and snow can be a pain, but in the middle of New England winter, sometimes you just have to appreciate the beauty of it.
And I just want to say again, thank you to the town of Sterling for being forward-thinking and having trucks that can use brine. It's still using salt, but it's way less salt, and it's more effective on the roads. Do you have a question?
Does Sterling use brine?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, right? Good. So thank you very much. And then the next step is just what we use on our homes and what businesses use on their walkways and things like that. Are there any more questions?
The effect of the salt on plants near the road, and I have some that are obviously getting burnt from the salt, and I read that gypsum is good to use to amend the soil,
Oh,
to reverse,
okay.
or
Reverse
help
okay.
get the salt out of that.
Interesting.
So, gypsum.
Yeah, yeah. Because a lot of pollutants will, dissolve or disappear over time, or go up through the roots and the water transpires.
Mm-hmm.
But salt is very persistent. There's no away.
Yeah.
It's
So
going.
when you see the plows going, and they just splash it,
Yes.
into the yards, and
Yes.
so. But I've noticed, they're getting burned over years and years of
Mm.
being exposed to it. So gypsum is supposedly.
Interesting.
I'll be trying it.
Yeah, I didn't know
You
that.
could ask at UMass Extension, I bet you that they could say, here's what we know about
Mhm.
that gypsum thing. That's really,
Yeah.
that kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Either that or they're going to say, okay, plant salt tolerant plants. Pretend you're at the beach.
All right. Well, Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Nick.
All right. Well, good morning. So just real quick about me, my name's Nick Ferry. I am one of the Watershed Protection Rangers for the Wachusett region. So what I'm going to be doing for you guys today is talking about probably the single coolest, I know the reservoir is the big one that we care about, but this is the coolest aquatic habitat. Okay, just so we're all aware. So we're going to talk about vernal pools, why they're important, and what they do. So vernal pools, as a whole, are temporary bodies of water that pop up in the springtime, hence vernal. They fill with snowmelt or sometimes spring rains, if we have one of those warm winters. They also are affected by groundwater, which is where the presentation on road salts can affect these guys as well. We'll get into that in a little bit. The way to tell them apart from a couple of other, smaller ponds, estuaries, stuff like that, there's no permanent inflow or outflow, so they're basically a puddle. They dry up completely in the summertime. So you'll be walking through the forest and you'll just see this big, kind of darker patch. And you look at it and say, well, it's dark and crunchy, and why is nothing growing there? Well, it's because it's flooded half the year. And the biggest one is that there are no populations of fish. The whole purpose for a lot of the animals I'm going to show you that go into these vernal pools is to breed. And if there are fish in there, their young will just not survive in any numbers. So vernal pools also vary year to year. There's some vernal pools that, like this slide says, they fill up in the springtime, dry up by mid to late summer, and then in the winter time it starts all over again. There's also some vernal pools that'll have water in them for 2-3 years. So here's a couple of pictures of what I would consider a typical vernal pool. They don't all look like this. So in the top left is basically what you would see if you were looking for a vernal pool today. We had a pretty decent amount of snow. We've had a ton of rain lately. So most of them are looking like that. They're pretty full. Some of the water is pretty clear, some of it's not. All depends on what the topography is around them and what's running into them. On the right is another vernal pool that's not completely dried up, but that's probably a June or July vernal pool that's really way down. And then below that is a vernal pool that's inside a hemlock grove. And it's been one of those winters where it's been warm, it's been cold, it's been warm, it's been cold. So the vernal pool is actually filling a little bit early. Doesn't affect anything, doesn't hurt anybody who's using the pool, but there it is. Also being underneath the hemlock trees, there's a lot of shade. It's not going to evaporate as quickly. So then we get into the stuff that lives in vernal pools and uses them, which is where I really like. I was always one of those little kids who would be bringing garter snakes home and asking my mom to keep them in my dresser drawer.
We're not asking her, just doing it.
Oh, I love it.
Oh, they're great. So there's a lot of animals that utilize vernal pools for a laundry list of reasons. Food, shelter, and then there's some animals that we're going to talk about that if there were no vernal pools, they would be. A couple of those species are up there now. We'll get into those in a little bit, but there's also a lot of rare species that utilize vernal pools. To the left there's 2 turtles there. The one on the left is a Blanding's turtle, and the next one over is a wood turtle. Both of those are considered threatened or endangered species here. And they utilize vernal pools quite a bit, especially wood turtles. Wood turtles are actually fairly terrestrial. So they utilize smaller water bodies, including moving water and vernal pools, to hunt and to get around. So when we talk about animals that live in and around vernal pools, we kind of break up into 2 different subsections. One of them is facultative. So facultative species. Thank you, I was about to do the same thing. So facultative species are species that don't necessarily need the vernal pool, but they really like utilizing them. So toads and frogs, of course, are going to use it for a huge chunk of their life cycle. There's a bunch of different species that use them. And then other species, like I said before, will utilize the space for feeding, breeding, just hanging out. They just like them, it's quiet. The top right there's a beautiful Drake wood duck. I threw him up there because I have a vernal pool on my property at home, and I have 2 wood ducks that are nesting in a hollow tree right next to it. Wood ducks are a cool waterfowl where they actually lay their eggs in hollow trees. So vernal pools, because they're in the forest, are really common areas for them to utilize to breed and to nest. And when the babies hatch, they actually do a leap of faith out of the tree.
Into the water.
Sometimes into the water, and if the pool drive a little more, they're hitting the ground. Don't worry, they're totally fine. They can survive a fall up to 50 feet. Yeah, well, they're very small and they're very puffy.
Smaller puppy.
Yeah. Below that, we have a little band of raccoons there looking for food. They'll utilize the pools to look for crayfish and bugs and snails and all sorts of other critters that'll be crawling through there. The snake down there as well, the northern water snake. They're pretty common throughout pretty much any water body in Massachusetts, really in the Northeast. But they will utilize vernal pools, especially if it's warm enough during what we call the vernal pool season. They'll come in and have a field day with some of the other animals I'm going to show you.
Yeah.
Beyond that's an eastern newt, which is a really cool species. They have a crazy life cycle. They start out as like a miniature salamander that has gills, lives underwater. They'll utilize vernal pools and live there for a while. They'll then come out of the vernal pools or out of swamps or another body of water into what I'm showing you there. They call them the red elvers. And they can stay like that for years. And then when they become ready to breed, they go back to water, turn green, and breed. They're pretty cool. They're kind of rarer around here now in the watershed. In some of our properties, we do still see a lot of them. I know in other places they're getting tougher to find.
How big are they? Usually?
Usually under 2 inches. They're pretty small.
Wow.
Some of the other salamanders I'm going to show you are not that small. They're much bigger.
And when I was at the Quabbin, I saw it crawling in the grass on one of the walkways to the water, or something, they were about that long.
Yep, that's about right. Their bright coloration is basically signaling to birds and other predators that like, hey, guess what? I am toxic and you are not going to want to pick me up. So they kind of walk around, kind of don't really like to hide, they don't really care. And then beyond that is a spotted turtle, which is a pretty common turtle to end up in vernal pools. Unfortunately, they're also kind of on the rare side, and you don't really see them. So facultative, like we said before, is stuff that doesn't need the vernal pools, but they just really like them. Toads, frogs, amphibians in particular, like basically all wetlands. But these 3 in particular can sometimes signal where a vernal pool is. That's something that we'll touch on later. But we have 3 here. So on the top left is a spring peeper. Now spring peepers are a tiny, tiny, tiny kind of tree frog. They have little sticky pads on their toes. And they have, to kind of identify them, they have kind of a cross on their back. You can kind of see it with that one. But for reference, they're about the size of my thumbnail. They're very, very, very small. They also make a very loud sound. I'm going to see if I can play it. There it is. So if you've heard that before, you can find them anywhere from drainage ditches to all sorts of other areas, but they really do like vernal pools. Okay, shut off. Uh-oh. We're just going to let that run out. So beyond that, the next guy over there is a gray tree frog. They're kind of cooler. A lot of people don't see them, but when I play the call after this one's done, you might recognize it. It's a very distinct call, and they're actually a little more common than people realize. They also do breed in vernal pools. You'll find them around marshy areas. They really like the edges of woodlands with wet areas. Let me see if I can get that to play. There it is.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I used to hear that sound and I thought it was flying squirrels. Not to say there are not flying squirrels in New England, there are. My mom just didn't really have a good grasp on biology at that point. So those tree frogs, so obviously live in trees, they have the sticky pads, you can see like that guy there. They also, when they're moving around, the backs of their legs can be yellow or kind of orange. Beyond the name, that one that I have on the screen is kind of gray. They can actually change color a little bit, so they can go from gray to green.
Oh.
So if they're in an area that has a lot of lichens and mosses and stuff that grows on the trees, they'll be green. In an area where it's just straight up bark, they'll be that color. And they can kind of go from a darker brown to a gray to a green. They can actually go between colors pretty quickly when you actually see them. It's kind of neat. And then beyond that is just our common American toad.
How big are those?
The tree frogs?
Yeah.
Not counting the legs, they're usually about that.
You
But
can
you'll
see
find-
those
You'll
more than.
find them smaller,
Yeah.
especially the juvenile ones, which are bright green anyway. You might see them, like I've got pictures of them on my daylilies.
Yeah.
Tiny little buggers and bright
Yep.
green.
Do they
Like a
eat
little-
them? Do they eat daylilies?
No. All amphibians are predatory. So all the amphibians I'm showing you here eat bugs and mostly invertebrates. But yeah, you'll find those guys in all sorts of weird, funky places. Anywhere that holds humidity, they'll tuck up. They also don't really climb super high into trees. So yeah, younger ones you'll find in your garden plants underneath leaves in the daytime, and at night you'll see them going across the lawn trying to get up somewhere.
On the side of your house.
Side of your house. Yep, side of your house. I've had one just hanging out on my truck the other day, or last year. Yeah, they just kind of pop up. The American toad, very common. They kind of utilize whatever wetland they got. So let's see what they got for a sound. There they are.
Telephone.
Yep. Move on from him if I can. There we go. Yeah, his their call is pretty cool when you hear it in person, but from the speaker it gets a little loud. The toads are pretty cool. They're very common. They utilize a whole bunch of wetlands. You will find them around vernal pools, especially a little bit later. They like it when it's a bit warmer. So outside those facultative species, we're going to talk about obligate species. So obligate species require the vernal pool to complete at least one part of their life cycle. So the salamander down the bottom, there's a spotted salamander. We'll talk about them in a minute. Them and a couple of other species of salamanders and another frog we'll talk about utilize the pools for breeding, and it's the only place that they will successfully breed, period. Without those pools, these things will not survive. Above him is a fairy shrimp, which I'll talk about in a second. Really cool critter. They live their entire lives in a vernal pool, and it's a very short life.
Especially if the pool dries up.
Exactly. So here's our fairy shrimp. So if you've ever had what's known as sea monkeys,
Yeah.
that's basically what these are. They spend their entire lives in vernal pools. They're pretty small. You know, they're basically like a brine shrimp. So think about them that size, little guys. So what they do is they breed in the vernal pools. They lay their eggs, and those eggs drift down to the bottom into the leaf litter. As the pool dries up, those eggs actually need a dormancy period. So in the photograph up there, kind of the middle guy there, he's got an egg sac right there by his pelvis, or what would be his pelvis. He's an invertebrate. They lay those eggs, they filter down, they dry out. Fairy shrimp to actually develop need a dormancy period. And certain species of fairy shrimp even have to have their eggs freeze before they will come back to life and hatch the next year. So the next year the pool will fill back up, those eggs will hatch, they'll have 2 to 3 weeks to breed, and then they'll all drop dead. So when we're looking for vernal pools, yeah, so when we're looking for vernal pools, obviously if you find fairy shrimp in a vernal pool, if you're so inclined to go through and look at it, it's guaranteed to be a vernal pool. They're also not good swimmers. So when I go back to that second slide, when I say if there's fish in there, it's not a vernal pool. If there's any fish in there, small, those things are just done. They're perfect little bite-sized morsels for them. So the big one that we usually like to go by is obligating amphibians. So just an array of different amphibians where they utilize vernal pools for breeding. So the wood frog is probably the most recognizable. We'll get into him in a second. They're very loud. Their call's distinct. I'll show you that in a minute. It kind of sounds like a bunch of ducks. And when they move, there's a lot of them. It's really neat. For salamanders, the spotted salamander, especially in this area, is kind of the go-to. He's the most common. They also get pretty big, which is kind of neat. The other species of salamanders are the blue spotted, the Jefferson, which tends to be kind of further western Mass, and then the marbled. I haven't seen a marbled since I was a little kid, so we'll see. The blue spotted, the Jeffersons, and the marbled are all listed under threatened or endangered status.
My husband did a project and they were in a line where they were, they were using the blue spotted.
Mhm.
They had to spend thousands and thousands of dollars
Oh, yeah.
to like protect it so it didn't screw up.
Oh, absolutely. And you got to think of an animal like that. He can't climb over a fence. There's a lot of things
Yeah,
he
it's
can't
insane.
do.
My
And
husband wasn't happy, but
yeah. Also, being amphibians, they're extremely sensitive to environmental impact. So going back to what Katheryn was talking about, salt is something that's going to affect them. Amphibians as a whole, when you see amphibians, they are slimy, very porous skin. They absorb whatever's in their environment straight through their skin. So even if I walked up to a frog today and just picked them up with my bare hands, if I washed my hands 2 hours ago and there's residual soap on my hands that I don't know about, you can hurt them. So road salts, things like that in water can be very, very detrimental to them, and they're developing offspring in vernal pools. So here's our wood frog. They are a just wild critter. So they're about the same size as the tree frog. They're about 1.5 inches, 2 inches in length. When you see them, they're usually going down to breed in vernal pools. They're fairly common. After they breed, they kind of just disperse throughout the woodland. They sound like a duck, which I'll play in a minute. And the coolest thing about them, at least to me, because I'm a sci-fi nerd, they're a true hibernating animal. So you can see the picture there, he's kind of encased in ice. In the winter time, these guys don't really burrow too deep. They don't get too crazy when it comes to hibernating, or at least taking care of themselves. They'll get under the leaves. But when it gets cold enough, they basically go into a cryogenic state. Everything shuts down. Their heart stops, brain function's gone, and they can literally freeze into an ice cube. Once the weather gets warm enough and they de-thaw, they're up, they're moving. It's like nothing ever happened. It's really, really neat. So let's take a listen. So that is the standard.
Sounds like a duck, looks
It's-
like a duck, it's not a duck. It's a
Yep, sounds like a duck. Now, this isn't a great representation, at least in my head, because usually when wood frogs go to their vernal pools, they don't go 10, 12, 14 of them at a time. They'll go hundreds, even thousands at a time. This will get deafening. This year, to be perfectly frank, was a weird year for vernal pools just because of the weather. Cold, warm. We never got what's called our big migration, where everything came at the same time, which I'm going to slide on that in a second, but it's just been a constant trickle. So vernal pools at this time of the year, they already got their eggs in it. Some of them are still pretty active, some of them are done, and yeah, it varies year to year, but usually they like to move around. No, not again. There you go. They like to move around on the first really warm, rainy night in spring. Is really when this kind of gets going. So let's look at our guy, the spotted salamander. They're probably the more common of the mole salamanders. All the salamanders I showed you there that are the obligate species are in the mole salamander category. These guys spend, 360 days of the year underground. You just don't see them. Then they spend 3 to 5 days above ground. They jump into the vernal pools and they breed. There's also some evidence that they may be able to hybridize with some of the other mole salamanders, but that hasn't been super well studied as to this point. And they get pretty big. I've found them upwards of 10 inches. They can get big and chunky.
Wow.
They can get big. Like I said, they're only up above ground maybe 3 to 5 days a year, and then, like I said, the weather has to be good for them. It's a cool animal, especially for me, who's a big nature guy, of course. It's an animal that my whole childhood I've never seen until I learned what a vernal pool was, and I see all of them in 2 days.
What's the one with the sort of orange all around it, like a orange stripe all the way around it? We have those everywhere at our house in Maine.
Oh, right down the
It's just a
back.
little salamander, but it's got like an
Yeah,
orange.
yeah. Those are redback salamanders. They don't require any of that stuff. No. So, like I was saying before, the Great Migration. So they call it Big Night in this area. Some areas have different areas for them. When I lived in Maine, where I went to school, they used to call it Road Pop Night.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Oh.
Yeah. And that's when we get into threats to vernal pools. Yeah. So during those days, all these animals will get up and just go. I live north. I actually live in New Hampshire, and we actually have in my town and a couple of other towns areas where they'll actually close the roads on the nights that we know this is going to happen, and just let them go.
How do you know they're coming?
You just look at the weather.
Oh.
You can look at the weather, and then you can drive down the road and say, "Oh, I can hear them now. Here we go," and they'll just shut it down, put cones up.
And they have migrations. I mean, there are known places. They cross
Yes.
the same, it's like snapping turtles. You always see
Yep.
them every year kind of thing, the same place. They go the same way. So some places have crossings. Up in Princeton, there's a love tunnel. People have made tunnels. In
Yeah.
Amherst, I used to help at the love tunnel down in Amherst as a kid,
Oh yeah.
getting them. And they would just set up barriers that would funnel them to that crossing.
Oh yeah.
That is,
Yep. And it's a really cool event to actually see if you get to catch it. You don't always catch it, like I said, every year. It doesn't happen. But when it does happen, it can be crazy. It's thousands of frogs, hundreds of salamanders, all just marching to pools. But yes, certain pools.
Steven Spielberg special.
Yep, but certain pools, it's an annual event. You know it's going to happen. You know, if there's one pool at the basin of some hill, all those animals are on the hill all summer, winter. You know they're going to go there, so you can prepare yourself for it. Yeah.
Could you notify our garden club about it and maybe we could make it a night out?
I do monitor it. That's something we can talk about. It's very difficult to
Do it
predict.
once, we don't have to do it every year.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is it
On your
happens-
bucket list, Jane.
Yep, the other thing is it always happens at night. So during the day, the wood frogs will still be active during the day. The salamanders in particular are not fans of daylight. You're just not going to see them during the day. They'll get right under the leaf litter, under rotten logs and stuff, hang out. And then once it warms up again, they'll hit the waters again. Once they're done breeding, they're gone. You won't see them again.
does DCR advocate for that kind of protection? Because I know a place in town here, off of Gates Road to Campground, there's a vernal pool there, or what I perceive to be a vernal pool. I don't know if anyone has actually certified it, but I'm sure, I mean, I see frogs crossing there, that there's a spot that actually could be cordoned off and people could still gain access to Route 12 on both ends.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be that much of a inconvenience to drivers to.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that we can definitely note. That's going to be up the chain for me, but I can definitely put that out and look at it. Certifying vernal pools is going to
I'll
come
be
up
covering
on
a little bit about
Yeah.
that.
Will you? Oh,
Yeah.
good, Mary.
Yep. So beyond actually seeing the animals, right? The other way that we can actually look for vernal pools and test is see if there's egg masses. Yes, those jelly globs of goo.
It's like Jello.
Yep. It's actually it's very fun to touch. I'm still.
I can see Jello.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously, like it says here, they're produced by amphibians. The two egg masses that are above there are an example of a salamander and a wood frog. Can't tell you what species of salamander. They all kind of look the same. So on the left, the salamanders, you can see their eggs seem to be a little bit bigger, and they kind of come out in like this big, grotesque sausage. So each individual egg is still in there. You'll see the individual little round eggs with the black people in the middle, and then they're all surrounded by a lot of jelly. On the right is the wood frog. So wood frogs produce a ton of eggs that are a little smaller. They don't have that extra bit of jelly around them, so they're kind of more dense. Also with wood frogs, they can be extremely numerous, and they can even make just these big squishy mats on top of a vast majority of smaller pools. So the one down the bottom there, that's excuse me, basically all wood frogs. So again, in the water, you can see the difference. So top left is your salamander egg case. You can see it's got a membrane all the way around. Wood frog down the bottom. And here's one of those mats.
Wow.
So as the eggs develop in pools that especially get a lot of sunlight, you can see they kind of turn green. They start growing hair algae, which is actually beneficial. So when the tadpoles hatch, they have an immediate food source. So the algae is feeding on the decomposing matter of the egg cases. The wood frog tadpoles hatch, they have an immediate source of food, start to grow, and we're off to the races.
Is that the same as string algae?
Yes.
It is.
Yeah, there's so many different kinds of algae. So we have a bunch of vernal pools in Wachusett. Some are certified, some are questionable. We do take an interest in keeping an eye on them and keeping them as pristine as possible. We do locate them in the spring. We record whatever changes, whether that be the diameters of the pools, pool water quality, anything like that. We've even gone to the extent in years past of actually having aerial surveys done in the springtime to look for potential vernal pools, which is pretty neat. I can tell you there's a few vernal pools in the watershed that I've been to over the last couple of years that are extremely productive. Like I said, this year's been kind of funky, but there's egg cases in the vast majority of vernal pools that I've visited in the last few weeks. So if you get out there and find one, you'll probably see the egg cases, if not even little tadpoles already. It's pretty neat. So vernal pool protection in Massachusetts is where I'm going to step away. That's where I'm going to be taking over for my colleague here. And she's going to go over the certification process of how the individual can protect a vernal pool in their community.
Good to see many of you. It's been a while. For those of you that haven't met me, my name's Marion Larson, and as Carol said, I live here in Sterling. And for 38 plus years, I've worked for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, first as a game warden, and then in information and education and outreach and communication, and I retired last month. So Carol got in touch with me a few months ago saying, oh, can you give a talk on blah, blah, blah? And I'm like, I have so much to do before the end of March. And so I kind of put her off. I put her off, but I said, you could call Katheryn and she might be able to do something. So we've finally done that, and we'll be working on another presentation later. But with the vernal pool, we thought vernal pools was good because it's springtime. It is vernal pool season. I can tell you on Tuesday night when I was driving back from a meeting here in Sterling, when it was raining, the wood frogs were out. My husband and I go out on basically listen for peepers or listen for wood frogs. And at nighttime, if it's warm, go out with a flashlight that has red, not, put cellophane or something over it. And I know that there's vernal pools around my house. We walk up and down the road looking to see fine peepers and wood frogs and sometimes the occasional salamander. When I say I know that there's vernal pools, they're biologically vernal pools, but there is also a regulatory definition of vernal pools, and that's the whole protection part that Carol was asking about. I can give you a little short deal on that, and I do have a sheet. I can give it to somebody if you want. I can email it to someone if you want the information on how to certify a vernal pool. Because they are special wetlands, and they can be protected by law under several different kinds of statutes. So let me pull out my reading glasses. These pools are protected under the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act. Anybody that's done work with the Conservation Commission, you might be familiar with that. But also, they're protected in some ways under the Federal Clean Water Act, the Massachusetts Water Quality Standards, and also Forest Cutting Practices Act. For instance, if somebody's doing some forestry, one of the things they have to do is determine if there's vernal pools on the property and indicate them on their plans, and they need to do protective things so that those pools are not, the habitats aren't disturbed. And then there is a certification process. There has to be a certified vernal pool. You can't just go, oh, I hear peepers, it's a vernal pool, you have to protect it. There's actually a process for certifying them to make sure that yes, these are vernal pools and they are subject to the protective regulations. And here's where my agency, and I'm still going to be saying we and my and our, all that sort of thing, because 38 years. But the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife is the agency that oversees the certification of vernal pools, which is done mostly by citizens. Our agency cannot go out across 5 million acres of Massachusetts and look for rare species or vernal pools. We are relying on citizen help. And a lot of people that are providing this information have a lot of background. But I can also tell you that there are kids who have certified vernal pools. In fact, a high school put together a booklet, and they were trained, and they trained other people on how to certify vernal pools. And their manual is called Wicked Big Puddles. Because when somebody says, what's a vernal pool? Oh, you know those weirdo, wicked, you know, they put those puddles that you see in the middle of the woods and there's no stream, you know, but so they call it Wicked Big Puddles. And so they've done a lot of certification. I'm not sure how much has been done lately because certain regulations changed in 2009. But here's how it works. Nick mentioned the aerial surveys. Back in the 1990s, our agency worked with the University of Massachusetts and a couple of other groups and conducted aerial surveys across the state. Airplane, taking pictures of the landscape. And they did this during the time when there's no leaves. Like during vernal pool time when vernal pools would be filled, so you have an idea. They figured out how to look at these aerial photos and be able to say, okay, potential vernal pools based on what they could tell about topography and some about the plants. From there, there's actually a CD, not a CD, there is a set of maps that you can get to online that talk about where there are potential vernal pools. So once they started mapping them, and people were certifying them, here in town, all the conservation commissions get information on where exactly vernal pools are located, so that if there's a development proposed and all that, you have that information. But the other thing that the agency has, and has online for everyone to see if they want to do, you could go and see, okay, in Sterling, do they have any areas where they've mapped where there might be, there's a potential vernal pool that's not certified. And you could go out and do the work to certify it. It's not easy work. Sometimes it takes a couple years because you don't know, and there's certain criteria. And one of the criteria Nick went over, remember when he talked about obligate and the facultative species? The only pools that can be certified are the pools that have the obligate species in them. They have to have the obligate species. The Ferry shrimp, the wood frog, those species that require them. They cannot live anywhere else. They can't survive anywhere else. Although I will tell you that we have, as an agency, put in some artificial vernal pools on a couple of our properties to protect an extremely rare species of salamander that there's like only 3 populations in a particular county. And they're in places where there could be development. So what?
Have they been successful?
Yes, there's
Oh,
been
wow,
good
that's a
news
lot.
on that, just in the last few years. And we have a magazine that has a little story about that. But anyway, you have to be able to document, you've got to take pictures, you've got to show on a map exactly where it is. You submit all that information online, or you can still do paper, but there's just a whole specific set of guidelines that you need to do. So, as I said, it's citizens that are helping us out. A lot of naturalists, other scientists, that kind of thing. When all that material comes in, when the application comes into the agency, our agency's Natural Heritage Program biologists, then they look at all of the paperwork. And say, okay, blah, 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 blah. You know, they got this. Oh, we have a question about that. You might get a phone call or a message, because electronically, they've been doing much more of this electronically, which is saving time. And say, hey, I need to know this, or gee, we need this, or can you tell me a little more, kind of thing. They review and see if it meets all the criteria. They got to do it carefully, because it has to do with how the regulations are set up. And then they're like, okay, this thumbs up, you get notified. Hey, you certified a vernal pool. It goes into the map showing where the vernal pools are every year. The agency sends out to the conservation commissions and planning boards, where, updates of those maps of those vernal pools. That's the same process that's also used just for reporting rare species, and you're reporting through the same system. So that is, and the maps and the pictures are required because you need to have physical evidence. I mean, one of the things they say, try to take a picture of the whole vernal pool. Send in pictures of the sounds of the chorus, the deafening chorus of wood frogs and peepers when there's a zillion of them out there. All that gets put together in that way. And what's helpful, and as I said, there are potential vernal pools in Sterling that probably have not been certified. About 20 years ago, I can't remember his name, but a guy who's really into amphibians and reptiles,
Yes.
he and his daughter, I cannot
I
remember
can't
his
either, I was
name.
trying to think of one the other day.
And he's not living here in Sterling anymore, but he kind of took it upon himself to go out and certify vernal pools. Now, here's the thing, very important, especially when you're talking to, I'm going to channel my law enforcement thing. Thou shalt not do this on private property without landowner permission, because that compromises things. I mean, think about it. A landowner would be really very, and rightfully so, upset that, what do you mean there's a certified vernal pool here? I didn't do this. They have plans for selling the land or doing some cutting on the land or that sort of thing, and this kind of pops up out of nowhere. That's a problem. And you are trespassing. And one of the things that I found, because I was going through the website, kind of refreshing my memory on some things, in at least 3 or 4 different places, we do not, you need landowner permission. You have to be compliant. It's up to you who's certifying it to follow all the laws. And you got to ask permission. Now, that being said, I know a very good friend of mine certified a vernal pool, but didn't need to be on the person's property because the vernal pool was right next to the road.
Right.
Road salt, don't forget about the road salt issue. But they were on the public road. They could get all the information that they needed. That's not very often that happens. But it is important, because you need to be respecting landowners' rights and the like. So that's kind of how the process works. And I don't have any more to add about that. But those of you who might be interested, I think the first thing is, given the reactions that I saw from folks about seeing them, the first thing to do is, hey, stick your head out the window tonight. Listen. I'm hearing peepers
Yeah.
I'm not
Big time.
tons, I'm
big
not
time.
hearing the big choruses, but when it rains, I mean, it is a very weird patterned year. I feel really bad for the guy that does a lot of our amphibian work. His rainy nights, he can be down, he's studying and trapping salamanders down in the southeast, northeast part of the state, and the central part of the state. His sleeping schedule is bizarre. It's all night work, and then he's having to drive home. But the first thing is, yeah, gotta see these things on the move. If you're out at night traveling and it's raining, you know, I'm doing this in the places where it's safe to do this to avoid the little buggers as they're hopping across. Also handling them, as Nick said, your hands make a difference. Frankly, it's best not to handle them. If you do have to handle them, I mean, I saw a spotted salamander, 2 o'clock in the afternoon up on the Kendall Hill Road area where we walk. And I go, what the heck? What are you doing? It is not raining. It is not dark. What?
Be killed.
You could get mushed because we were on the road. And so even your hands, your oils, they have such sensitive skin. I mean, your fingerprints, as it were, would be on them. So I went over, scooped up a bunch of leaves. My husband scooped away, and I carefully got it across the road before the car came along, and the person with the dog on leash. but you know, you see them. The efts, you can see them in the daytime. When it's warm and moist, we sometimes count the you said elvers, those are the young eels. Efts,
Oh, you're right.
red efts.
I thought so.
The red efts. So this is the newt that has that bizarre,
the
the
red.
orange
Mhm.
one. You can see them throughout the summertime on humid, cool, damp days. Sometimes when we go hiking, my husband and I start counting. On Mount Wachusett, there was one big, massive day. We counted 900.
No.
And it was only the first 3 miles of the hike, and then we were in a different habitat.
Wow.
But under hemlock groves, you'll see, and they can be little teeny ones, but when they're bigger, you know, like Nick was saying, they're like that, but you can see different sizes, and they're very cool. They're very cool. I would also say, if you know where the Administration Road area is on Mount Wachusett, there's a pond there.
Yes. Cellar actually, isn't it?
I don't know. It's sort of like a little dam kind of thing, but it's right there by the parking area. That's a place where you could see some egg masses of newts and a couple of others. It's not a vernal pool, but you can see the adult newts swimming around, green with a little bit of yellow. But you can see egg masses. I haven't been up there in a few weeks, but that's where if I tried, that's where you could see egg masses. So hey, do you have questions for Nick and I about vernal pools or Katheryn?
I rescued a spotted salamander off the road. This was probably 10 years ago or more. And because it had been, tail had been run over. So I didn't really know how to pick it up or something. I don't know. I brought it in the house, put it in an aquarium thing with damp leaves and all that, just so that maybe it would be okay. So oddly, fungus grew on its tail,
Yeah.
killed the whole tail, but it healed.
Yeah.
So I picked him up, brought him over to the vernal pool, and let him go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Regeneration? I don't know.
Some amphibians can do regenerations, others can't, but it's amazing. They can be so fragile, but also so resilient, like Carol said. Best thing to do is, just like we say with turtles crossing the road, that season is coming up now. Take the animal, take it off the road if it's safe, in the direction that the critter is going. Don't say, oh, it needs to go to a better place, because they're hardwired into their own migration routes. You screw them up. Also, with turtles and those, you're also kind of screwing up the population dynamics. So if it's going this way,
It's a snapper,
Put it
hold it
down.
way close to the back too.
or get a shovel out of your car
I
and
almost
push
got
it.
it one day, I'll tell you, I almost got it.
So that's, you know, that's how you can, that's how you can help. And then again, and remember, your own house, remember Katheryn's talking about the salt, the road salt thing, salting your driveway and all that. I mean, I see peepers and wood frogs, and occasionally I've had a spotted salamander, you know, right next to the driveway. So be thinking about that aspect as
I'm
you're.
gonna make some brine, I think that's really cool.
Yeah, you could, or you could be really lucky. For the last 2 winters, I have a downhill slope, but it faces to the south, sun. That's the only reason I bought the place. I could handle it. And we have not had to use even, you could just put down plain old sand, or you could put down kitty litter. Or for the last 2 years, we haven't had a need to do it. But, you know, just things to think about, because they're on your property. The wood frogs, the gray tree frogs. Look around your hoses and where your faucets are, because I often will find one. They just look like a piece of lump of lichen.
They do.
And they will change color, so. But any other questions you have for us?
No, thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.